When we talk about APIs, they're typically consumed by computer programs written by developers. Once written, they're operated and executed automatically by computer programs when needed. As such, documentation is crucial in the development of an API. The API documentation needs to be precise, and developers need to understand the usage pattern. Documentation is also where the API developer and consumer could both manage their expectations. So, where can we find API documentation? The first place to look for is typically from the vendors who built the device. After all, who better to tell you about the usage pattern than the folks who built them? Sometimes we could also find documentation or examples of usage from the devices or web services themselves. This might come in the form of a sandbox or lab area for the users to experiment. It is a great idea to take advantage of these sandboxes when available. It is also worth mentioning that many of the API documents are automatically generated by frameworks such as Swagger. They follow the Open API specifications to allow greater interoperability between web services. Now that we have learned the concepts of making a RESTful API request, let's see how we could use the same command line tools to make API requests toward a NXOS device from our lab. To begin, we will need to make sure the NX API feature is enabled on our Nexus device. So let's SSH to the device. For me, I'm going to SSH using the Cisco username at the lab IP of 172.16.1.90. So I'll use SSH Cisco at 172.16.1.90. The password by default is just Cisco. If I do a show run, include pipe, using the include keyword and NX API, I could see the feature NX API is enabled as well as the NX API sandbox. By default, it is listening on port 80. I would type exit to exit out of the Nexus device. Let me type in clear to clear the string. Because REST API is based on the HTTP transport, we could use many of the tools that we're already familiar with, such as curl. So if I type in curl to the IP address 172.16.1.90/INS, which by documentation is the API endpoint, I could see I get a 401 authorization required. Let me clear that. If I use curl with the authentication switch, which in this case is -u, by default, as we saw before, it uses the username of Cisco and password of Cisco. So what I'll use is curl-u Cisco column Cisco and the IP address 172.16.1.90/INS. I get a 405 not allowed. Let me clear that screen. I also want to introduce a very useful tool, especially when we're just getting started with the APIs. It's called HTTPy. Let's install HTTPy first. Because I'm on the Ubuntu machine, I could use the app package management system. What I'll do is I'll install it via sudo app install HTTPy. I will enter my root password. And to invoke HTTPy, I will basically use HTTP on the command line. Here, you can see I'm using HTTP --help to know all the options available to me with HTTPy. Let's use HTTPy and execute the same call to our NXOS device. HTTP 172.16.1.90/INS. I get the same 401 unauthorized, as well as the authenticate basic realm secure zone in the header. So keep this in mind when we go over the HTTP response code, as well as HTTP authentication section later on. You can see, using HTTPy, I have a better color code to signify the header section, the response code, as well as the body. Let's use HTTPy to perform the authenticated header again toward the Nexus device. Let me clear the screen. Using the same command, but with the switch of -a will provide us for authentication. In this case, I'm using http-a Cisco Cisco 172.16.1.90/ins. Again, I will get a 405 not allowed in my response, as well as the color-coded section for the header, as well as the response body. In theory, we could use the same HTTP or curl to make an API request to the Nexus device with a working solution. However, because the Nexus device requires a more involved header values, post method, and HTTP message, it will not make sense at this point until we go over the sections on those respective topics. So here, I will use the HTTP to make simple GET requests for some of the URIs on the web. For example, I will use http-v for the verbose option toward github.com. And because we use the verbose option, we could see the top part is our request. By default, it is a GET request toward the root URI, and the user agent is HTTP. The second section is the response code as well as response message from GitHub. In this case, it uses the 301 response code moved permanently to redirect us to the HTTPS version of github.com, as specified in the location https github.com. Let's look at another example, http-v put httpbin.org/put, and I'm going to use the command line option to add extra HTTP header, API-key full, and also the command line option to add HTTP body, which is hello under equals world. As you can see, I get a more verbose response back. As we can see at the top, in this case, our request is using the HTTP put request with the relative URI of /put. The optional header API key is included in our request. The body of hello world in JSON format is also sent over. The response we got was 200 OK. And because of the website's nature, it includes the request body in its response. So that is two examples of using HTTP for making API requests for URLs such as github.com and httpbin.org.